Welcome back. We're now at the second of our videos related to Chapter 1 of the Harris-Platzner textbook, and we are now going to turn to the discussion of the ages of ancient Greek history that they describe for you in the Harris-Platzner textbook. This will just be a quick run-through. They are also described for you on your schedule entry for June 28th, Tuesday. Now, before I turn to that though, we're going to play a little game. Here is an item. Pause your video for a moment and see if you can recognize what that is. Don't look it up online. See if you remember it. Pause your video. Okay, do you recognize it? If you said that that is the image of the owl and the olive that appears on an ancient Athenian drachma in honor of the goddess Athena, you are absolutely perfect at Greek history. You may not have to take this course. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, whenever this symbol of Athena shows up, it means that I'm about to ask you a question. And that, in fact, was the first question that I asked you. So now you're about to get another test question. And the test question has to do with this right here, the Trojan War. Again, pause your video and quickly write down a guess for when you think the Trojan War happened. I'm going to give you some dates that are possibilities. Choose the one that you think is correct after you pause the video after I list you the dates. Here they are. 2000 BC. 1200 BC, 800 BC, 546 BC, 44 BC. Those are your 5 choices. Pause your video and quickly write down which one is right. Well, let's see how much you know about the Trojan War. The correct answer of those 5 is 1200 BC. The Trojan War happened right about the end of the Mycenaean period that's listed up here, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail, and is also given to you in your textbook. But 1200 BC is when the Trojan War is thought approximately to have occurred. Okay, let me now turn to a little bit of run-through on our Greek ages from Chapter 1 of the textbook. So first of all, the Minoan civilization is the one that was occupied on Crete. And if you now have your map downloaded from your schedule or from your resources on Sakai, you will see that Crete is the large, long, skinny island that occupies the southern Aegean Sea, right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And Minoan civilization occupied Crete, but also extended far beyond Crete over a whole group of islands and cities in many different directions. It was a very powerful maritime power for many years. In fact, it was actually there for almost 2 millennia. And it died out approximately 1400 BC. It was believed originally that it died out because of the eruption of Thera, which is an island to the north of Crete that you can find on your map. And that this really very violent eruption, in fact probably the most violent of anything in recorded history, at least 10 times as strong as Krakatoa in Indonesia in the 1800s, that this eruption spewed ash all over the Aegean and Mediterranean worlds and eventually blanketed Crete and Minoan civilization in that period around 1600 BC and thereby destroyed it. Eventually, however, that theory came in question because it was discovered, of all interesting things, by tree rings off in Greenland, that the ash production was not timed correctly for when Minoan civilization archaeologically appeared to have ended. It was about 200 years off. So it's instead been thought that, and this is in the video that we will see on the 3rd week, Secrets of the Dead, it's instead thought possibly that a tsunami was generated by the island directly north of Crete and swept across the eastern edge of Crete and may have crippled Minoan civilization for about 200 years until eventually it was taken over by the Mycenaeans. The Minoans appear to have been a relatively peaceful organization despite their conquest of the world around them. They in fact never built walls around their cities. Their main occupation was Knossos, which is a city in the center of Crete that was excavated by Sir Arthur Evans in the late 1800s. It features the famous palace with the labyrinth underneath it, which may possibly have been the same labyrinth where the Minotaur was kept that was eventually killed by Theseus from Athens. We have quite a few remains of those surviving. And this palace is one of the premier, most wonderful archaeological finds anywhere in the really early Greek world. Minoans wrote in a script referred to now as Linear A, which for many years was not even deciphered, and it was very difficult to read. There has been recent breakthroughs on that, getting it deciphered. So the Minoan civilization lasted, as we say, for almost 2 millennia. Eventually it was superseded by the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans occupied mainland Greece, especially the area right around the eastern Peloponnesian Peninsula. You'll see that on your map. If you find where Argos is, you'll see that Mycenae is right near it. It's on the eastern edge of the peninsula called the Peloponnesus. That's the southern part of Greece. And the Mycenaeans lasted until about 1100 BC. And 100 years before that, they appear to have sailed overseas across the Aegean Sea over to the Dardanelles in northwest Turkey and sacked the city of Troy. Why exactly that happened, we really cannot tell. The archaeologist who brought this to our attention, that this was a real city and not just a made-up story by Homer, was Heinrich Schliemann. He unfortunately did a not particularly great job of archaeological digging in that area. He actually rather badly wrecked the area trying to get the evidence that he wanted. But despite that, he set the standard, let's say maybe by showing what not to do. But he did set the standard for later archaeological efforts, and he also did unearth, both at Troy and at Mycenae, remains that seem to demonstrate that some type of Trojan War did occur. So while it's not likely that it was because of the kidnapping of a woman named Helen, it still does show that there was a fire, some kind of military invasion in that area that does indicate that a Trojan War of some sort did occur. So we're really very pleased to have a connection between the poetic works of Homer and the archaeological remains that show that these two things actually did go together. So that's the Mycenaean age. A whole group of civilizations all died out together right around the Mycenaean times. 1100 BC, Mycenaeans, Hittites, Egyptians all seem to have just died out all at the same time, maybe due to the invasions of a group of people known as Sea Peoples from some of the ancient texts that we have there. We do not know who these Sea Peoples are, but they seem to have sailed around and caused mayhem, and as a result, we lost some of these civilizations. There was then about 300 years of relative inactivity in Greece. In fact, a whole century of complete, total darkness. We refer to it as the Dark Age period to about 1000 BC. And then we come eventually into the Archaic Age, 800 BC, which is when we start to see the first renewed archaeological remains, and we see now the cities being repopulated and rebuilt, and new governments and new institutions being put in place. That whole period is referred to as the period of the polis, the Greek city-state, and that becomes prominent for several more centuries in Greek history, and it's completely different from anything going on in the old Mycenaean palace-based worlds. So Archaic Age goes down to 480 BC, then we go to Classical. Classical is when we see dominance from 480 to 323 BC by the polis Athens. Athens, of course, today is currently the capital of Greece, and it was indeed one of the most powerful and successful polis in the ancient Greek world. Athens lasted as a dominant power on and off through this period. She was very strong in the 400s, then she got beaten by her southern neighbor Sparta, but then came back to prominence again and then lost prominence again, especially by this period, because by that time the polis had all started fighting with each other more than was really warranted. They did not observe the growing power of a king in Macedonia named Philip, who was in fact the father of Alexander the Great, and eventually Philip came down and conquered all of the Greek cities and took over that whole area as part of Macedonia. Philip himself actually died a couple of years after he accomplished this in 336 BC, and his successor was the very well-known Alexander the Great, who not only conquered Greece, but also went overseas and took over the entire Eastern world, all the way out to India, occupied principally by the Persians and then Indians. He took over that area and eventually died of an illness out in that part of the world in 323 BC. So most of our literature comes from archaic periods and classical periods as far as surviving. Hellenistic period refers to the final stage of Greek history from 323 down to the conquest of Corinth in 146 BC, and that's when the Romans take over, and Greek history is considered to end at 146 BC. And the Hellenistic period is after Alexander the Great's death, and it's when we see a lot of scientific and mathematical progress with the library and the museum at Alexandria. There's also the famous library up in Pergamum, which is again in the northwest of Asia Minor. And quite a lot of travel, a lot more cosmopolitan approaches to literature, to art, in many different places. But it was also a politically very chaotic time with a lot of disturbances, a lot of separate different entities of power in different places, mainly because when Alexander the Great passed away, he did not have an heir. And so several different ruling powers came in his place to occupy different areas, and there was no really effective centralized power anymore. And that left the whole area eventually vulnerable to Roman incursion. So when Corinth, which was had become one of the most powerful cities in Greece, was finally leveled in 146 BC by the Romans, that put an end to the ancient Greek world. So this is a very basic summary of what we have in chapter 1. Our next video will now turn to chapter 2. We will look first at the so-called external methods of interpreting Greek myth in the first video coming up, and then the second video will turn to the internal methods for interpretation. We'll see you on the other side. Thanks.